Okay, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Richard Johnson. I am a historian of the Labour Party. In fact, one of my co-authors of my book on the history of the Labour Party is in this room, Mark Garnett, Keeping the Red Flag Flying, available um, online, at least, maybe not in bookshops anymore. And I'm also a politics academic at Queen Mary University of London and a co-founder of this group, Labour for the Constitution, along with Gautam and Gabriel. Um, I will explain a little bit about the purposes of our briefing here this morning, but first, I wonder if Gautam and Gabriel, you might also just introduce yourselves for our audience.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Gautam. I'm a Labour Party member and also a Fabian Society member, and I'm a patent attorney in training, so kind of legal related job. Yeah, started also a co-founder of Labour for the Constitution with Richard. We met at a conference that he did on the kind of state of the British Constitution and the reforms that it's undergone in this century so far.
And good morning, everyone. Yes, as Richard says, my name is Gabriel Osborne. I'm also one of the co-founders of Labour for the Constitution. Met Gautam and Richard at that same fantastic conference, and I am currently a trainee solicitor.
Well, thank you very much. So the impetus for today's meeting was partly due to the Labour Deputy Leadership Conference, which has put onto the table some of the procedures relating to how Labour elects its leader and deputy leader. But it was also shaped by a perception that actually there is kind of profound ignorance or lack of understanding about Labour's current rules in electing its leader and deputy leader, and also the process for challenging a leader and deputy leader. Just to give one example, last week I was listening to the podcast called Not Another One, and on that podcast, the Labour journalist Steve Richards was asked by the now Reform commentator Tim Montgomery, how do Labour's leadership election rules work? And Tim said to Steve, uh, "Do you have a vote of do you have a vote of no confidence in your leader before you can have a leadership election?" And Steve Richards said, "Oh yes, no, there is a vote of no confidence mechanism before you would then move into a leadership election. There is no such thing." And I thought, gosh, if Steve Richards, who's extremely knowledgeable and very well connected person in the Labour Party, isn't clear on what those rules and procedures are, then maybe that this is a much larger uh, lack of understanding. So I think so. What we're going to do is I'm just going to first reflect on how we got to the rules that we have now. Then Gautam is going to talk about what the rule book actually says, and he's taken his lawyerly eye on it. And then Gabriel is going to talk about maybe some opportunities for fixes and reform. So I think that part of the problem that we have is that writing about leadership election rules is not a particularly sexy topic for journalists. And so these rules get kind of modified in the background year on year at party conferences, and very little attention is paid to them. But they're actually extremely consequential in questions about who ultimately is in charge of running this country. Fundamentally, Labour is still operating in the basic framework of, or the shadow of the reforms that Ed Miliband brought in his Collins Review in 2014, which were first put into place in 2015 for the elections of the leader and deputy leader. The first to be elected under Ed Miliband's rules were, of course, Jeremy Corbyn as leader and Tom Watson as deputy leader. Now, there have been some changes, important changes to those rules since then, including the removal of the category of registered supporter, which was got some attention at the time. These were individuals who weren't even members of the Labour Party, but were allowed to vote in the elections for Labour leader and deputy as long as they paid a nominal fee and, uh, you know, promised to not be anti-Labour people. Um, But basically, it still remains the case that the party membership is in the driving seat of the fate of Labour leaders and deputy leaders, and really the role of MPs, who had once been the entire electorate for electing leaders, was then shrunk back in the 80s into electoral college, where they were 30% of the uh, electoral college that was expanded to a third. But basically, I have no role now in the final question, or their only role is in the nominating process. And Gautam's going to go through all of that. I think another reason why people are not so knowledgeable about the process is because our minds have been overly informed by the conservative rules. Because of course this has been so much instability at the top of the Conservative Party that people think that the conservative rules are basically synonyms of Labour's rules, but there are, as Gautam will spell out, important differences, not least the absence of that vote of no confidence procedure. And um, the third confusion is when people talk about the process for removing a Labour leader, there's a lot of folklore over this, where basically people say, well, Tories Tories are a party that is a party of absolute monarchy tempered by regicide, whereas the Labour Party never removes its leader. And this is a bit of folklore. I mean, it is true that the last successful formal leadership challenge was over a century ago when Ramsay MacDonald challenged John Robert Clines in 1922. But it's not the case that Labour leaders haven't been challenged before. Since then, Hugh Gaitskell was challenged a couple of times. Neil Kinnock was challenged by Tony Benn in 1988. And I think very importantly for our purposes, in 2016, Jeremy Corbyn was challenged under basically this framework. It's slightly different from what it was in 16, but it's basically that framework. And I think commentators have misread that result in terms of what they think would happen in the future. Because basically what you had there was you had a Labour leader where there was overwhelming opposition to him from Labour MPs, but overwhelming support to him among Labour members. And under the Labour rule system, that's very advantageous for the incumbent. Because basically the rules make it impossible for MPs to remove a leader unless the members give their say so, unless the members give their blessing. Politically speaking, we're in a completely different world. I think we're almost in the opposite situation at the moment, at least based on some of the internal polling of Labour membership, where we may have a PLP that is majority in favour of keeping the leader, at least at the moment, but a membership that would be majority in favour of voting for an alternative leader. And so what that process opens up is the possibility of a minority of Labour MPs acting against the majority will of the parliamentary party, being able to throw the leadership question to the membership and the members being able to remove a leader. So you could, in theory, have a leader who has three-quarter support from the PLP, but actually be removed as leader. And there's nothing those MPs can do about it if there's sufficient coordination by a relatively small minority of MPs. But that, I think, takes us into where the rules are. And so I'm going to hand over now to Gautam to explain that.
Yeah, so the actual rules, it's on the surface a fairly simple five-step procedure. As Richard says, there's no requirement, unlike in the Conservative Party, to have a vote of no confidence. So just to provide the Conservative context, they need 15% of MPs are needed to call a vote of no confidence, and the vote of no confidence requires 50%. But for the Labour Party, actually all that's needed is for a challenger. The first step is that a challenger seeks supporters. And if they have 20% of sitting Labour MPs supporting them, that begins the process of a leadership election. So all they need to do is gather 20% of sitting MPs in support, step two, inform the General Secretary in writing that they accept this nomination that they've received from 20%. of MPs. The nominations are then published by the party, and then the National Executive Committee has to start the voting procedure, which is the appointment of a deputy returning officer and so on. And then the voting happens. And so actually, there's no requirement for the whole Parliamentary Labour Party to get together and decide at any point that they want to remove the current Prime Minister. All that's needed is, as Richard says, a minority of MPs, a single MP to gather maybe 33 supporters. No, sorry, that's wrong. That's the CLP rule. It's
Be 80, won't it? Because it's the
80,
same for
yeah.
the deputy at the moment. Yeah.
80 supporters, and then a leadership election then immediately has to proceed from that under the current rules. Now, interestingly, the threshold for nominations for a challenger who's challenging an incumbent leader or deputy leader is actually lower than required for a nomination if there's a vacancy. So if there was a vacancy, you'd need 20% support from 20% of MPs, but you would also need support from either 5% of the constituency parties, or a slightly more complicated thing where you need support from at least 3 affiliated societies, of which 2 have to be unions, and altogether they represent 5% of the affiliated membership, which is importantly not the same as the total membership of the party. So that's a higher threshold for nominations in the case of a vacancy. And in addition, there's a rule that in the case of a vacancy, nominations must be made at all member meetings of the PLP. That rule doesn't exist for a challenge. So that means that a challenge can happen under the radar. There's no requirement for it to happen in the open. All really that's needed is for the challenger to send a letter to the General Secretary with 80 signatures on it. And then the voting, as Richard said, it immediately goes to the party members. And so a challenger with 20% support amongst MPs, but strong support amongst the membership, could oust an incumbent leader who has strong support amongst MPs, but maybe a weaker position with the membership. There are also kind of additional quirks in the rules. So, for example, the rules still require that the leader and deputy leader are elected at a party conference, but the voting no longer has to take place at a party conference, which sort of suggests that the voting happens, and then we were just discussing this before, the voting happens, then a party conference has to be called in order to announce the results, for example, which seems a bit unnecessary. And there are a few other quirks, such as this point about affiliated membership not really being defined. So there's a question of if you're a member of an affiliated organization like the Fabian Society and you're a full member of the Labour Party, do you count as part of the affiliated membership or not? The rules are kind of unclear on a lot of points. In general, give a lot of power to the NEC to write guidelines to clear up any points of confusion. So that's a brief overview of where we stand. It gives a few levers to be turned for kind of incremental changes. And I'll hand over to Gabriel to kind of go through that in detail.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think as Gautam very well sets out, there are many holes and problems with the rules as they stand. So it would take a lot longer than we have to go through all of the changes that should probably be made. So for that reason, I think what we'll do is focus on just the leadership rather than the deputy leadership. We have views about that, perhaps we can discuss, and in sort of, just pick out a couple of points. So our main priority would be to restore, or at least go some way to restoring, the place of Labour MPs in the election of leadership process. So we have an ideal change, but being realists as well, we have some more incremental options too. So the ideal change would be that, as Richard pointed out, it once was, the Labour leader should be elected solely by the Parliamentary Labour Party, that is, Labour members of the House of Commons. This, of course, will likely prove very difficult to do, especially if you were to do this reform and go about it in one fell swoop. Members, you can bet, will not be particularly happy about relinquishing the power that they currently have, and it would, would cause a whole stink. And Labour Party's got quite a lot of problems as at the moment anyway. So why do that right now? So in terms of more incremental reform that still have this sense of increasing the role of the PLP at their heart, I think we can focus on two. So we have the quick fix option. As Richard points out, there isn't currently a vote of no confidence mechanism in the Labour rulebook. One should be put in. MPs should have to actually vote that they have no confidence in a leader before any challenge can then be mounted. Then we have a bolder move, which Gautam has suggested to us, which is that a challenger, before it goes to the ballot, before members are able to exercise their vote in a what would usually be a runoff between two candidates, before we can get to that stage, any challenger would have to receive the nominations of at least 50% of Labour MPs. So again, the point of this is increasing, restoring the role that the PLP has historically, and in our view, for constitutional reasons, should play in the election of the leader. I think maybe it's a good time. I mean, we could say more, but I think maybe it's a good time to see if there are any questions on that, and then we can fill in some of the detail as is necessary.
Yes, I think that's a good idea. We have in the room people who are also quite well read on the rules. I know, for example, we have Dr. James Groves, who's one of the leading experts in the country on the Labour Party rule book. So yes, we open it up to questions, discussion. If there's any points of information from the floor, any points of clarification, we're very happy to discuss those. James, yes, I thought you might have something to say.
Yes, hello everyone. So yes, I'm the secretary at Lancaster and Wyre Constituency Labour Party. My day job, I work at Lancaster University in the maths department. The one thing that thanks for organising this, sort of prompted me to look at recent changes to the rule book, and the really interesting recent change, and it's interesting you're talking about hurdles and no confidence, is that going back, there was a particular rule that used to say when the PLP is in government and the leader and or deputy leader are prime minister and or in cabinet, an election shall proceed only if requested by a majority of party conference on a card vote. That rule was not there when we were in when the Labour Party was in opposition, and thus sort of because there was never any real suggesting that Blair or Brown were going to face such disagreement, was essentially sort of sat there, and people used to debate what does that actually mean. And in practice, it used to mean there's really no way that if we're in government, that a challenge is going to happen, because you would effectively need to convene a special session, a conference, and it really would be blood on the carpet style. And what's interesting is that, and throughout the opposition years recently, of course, this never really came into play, and these changes that you indicated were made. So the famous changes when Corbyn was leader and was challenged by Angela Eagle and Owen Smith sort of clarified and simplified a lot of the process. But what's very interesting is that clause that says when we're in government, you can basically only, you would still invite potential challenges from the Parliamentary Labour Party to reach some threshold, most recently 20%. But then essentially there was almost an unmeetable hurdle. That was removed only in 2024, as in last year's conference, in an amendment which met absolutely no debate whatsoever, as far as I could tell. It was presented by the NEC as a tidying up amendment in the way they often do. There was one very, very long set of amendments to the constitutional rules, which essentially met very, very little, I think no opposition, but essentially removed that entirely. So now we do have this situation where effectively 20% of the PLP will trigger a challenge to the Prime Minister if they want, and that's never actually been there before. I don't know if any of you, if you noticed that. I only really noticed that when I was sort of reading up in preparation for this, but it does seem we have now created this system of effectively having a 1/5 of the PLP can trigger a leadership election.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that in the rules there are still different procedures for when the party is in government and opposition for if there's a vacancy, but they've removed all of those special rules for when it's a challenge. I hadn't realized it was as recently as that, as last year. It does seem like no one has holistically thought about. I mean, it's not clear to me. I don't know what your view is on whether this is intentional or whether they've not. No one's kind of joined up all the dots when they've done reforms.
My inkling would be that it seems to belong. There's a lot of recent changes that have come about because lawyers and expert and sort of people who like to think about these things have looked through the rules and sort of tried to point out things that they think are archaic or effectively might lead to some constitutional crisis. And you could imagine a situation where, not just 20, but say 90% of the PLP wanted to challenge the effectively the Prime Minister, but then party conference either the NEC declined to call a party conference, which might be possible. Imagine a sort of the hypotheticals of Prime Minister Corbyn, for example. Either the NEC declines to call declines to call a special conference, or won't put it to party conference, or party conference says no. I think it would have been for that reason. So they removed what they thought would be a real constitutional crisis type hurdle. But it is now easier than ever to challenge a prime minister under Labour. It was always law that you could do this for the Conservatives, but for Labour, even if you got the nominations, you're never actually going to get it beyond a symbolic declaration in the Conference Arrangements Committee report. Oh, this many MPs supported a challenge. Deal with that, Prime Minister. But now it would actually happen.
I think that's absolutely right. Thank you so much, James, for bringing all of that in. And it shows once more that there's almost been a kind of overlearning from the Corbyn years. And so the rules have been written in a way to make it easier for MPs to take out a leader under the assumption that the problem would be that you would have a leader that MPs couldn't get rid of but wanted to get rid of. But now we might have made ourselves a situation where it's too easy for MPs to get rid of a leader. And even if a majority of MPs want to keep that leader, there's now no mechanism for a majority of Labour MPs to keep the leader in place. Are there other questions or comments from the floor? Well, in that case, we wanted to keep it under half an hour, so we've remarkably kept time. That's brilliant. Thank you everyone for your role in that, and thank you all for coming. We're going to probably put this up on our YouTube channel. So if you know of anyone who might have been interested in what we were talking about today, then they can get it there. And also, I published a piece on Left Foot Forward yesterday called Understanding Labour's Leadership Election Rules, which you just find on Left Foot Forward. And that sets out quite a lot of what we talked about today. But thank you very much. Thank you to Gautam and to Gabriel and to James for your great contributions as well.